All right, welcome everybody to our YPS and Rad Chicks book club. Today we're going to be talking about the book Athena Rising, How and Why Men Should Mentor Women. We are very lucky today that we have one of the authors, David Smith, PhD, who has joined us for this discussion. And our guest moderator is Charath Patel, who is a radiologist and one of the leaders of the RAD diversity group. And as always, you have me and Agnes, as well as our ACR staff, who is keeping track of attendees so you can obtain your CME credit. So as you can see from our very first page, all of our social media accounts, and if you are going to be using any of them, those hashtags to use. And as our slide just saying that none of us have any financial relationships to disclose. So we can go ahead and maybe get started with our first question. So this is a question that and a reminder to attendees, if you want to participate, you can click that icon to raise your hand. You can also use the chat option and or question option to ask any of us questions, and especially if you'd like to remain anonymous, just write that you'd like to be anonymous and we can ask your question or give a comment on your behalf. And so now we'll go ahead and get started. And this is our first question, and it's a question that I wanted to pose to our author and our guest moderator, because the focus of this book is on men and how men and why they should mentor women. And I know our audience tends to be majority females. So what I wanted to ask our author, why did you kind of write this book? What is it about women that made you realize this was an important book to write? What do women bring to the table? Why should they be on boards and leadership roles, etc.? So Dr. Smith, if you'll want to tackle that first.
Absolutely. So first, thank you to Agnes and Taj and Charath and everybody for coordinating this tonight. And on behalf of my co-author, Brad Johnson, it's a delight to be with all of you. So just a little background on why this is important. And I think this is it's critical that we start with this, and Brad and I often, when we're doing our keynote talks and a lot of the workshops, we do start with this, because and even in the book, as you see, we start with the why and not the how, because it is important to kind of recognize some of the challenges out there. And when we started writing this Athena Rising, the motivation behind it was really in understanding how in a lot of very traditionally male dominated professions and industries out there, that there just wasn't a whole lot of movement in leveling the playing field and getting us closer to gender parity and eliminating a lot of the gender equity issues that are going on in the workplace out there. And in particular, one of the challenges was just engaging men in this conversation, because these tend to get bent up. When we say gender equity, they become a women's issue or women's leadership issue in particular. And men often look at that and say, well, that's not my problem, it's not my issue, and they don't engage in it. But these are leadership issues, right? These are for everybody to engage in, because the importance of it is really in trying to achieve the diversity and inclusion goals that we have for all of our organizations out there, to try to get us closer to gender parity. We need to be doing that, one, because again, there's a host of reasons. One in particular, I think that we often talk about, is some of the business case issues that many of you probably are very familiar with, and I think certainly in the medical profession for all of you, that again, we make better decisions. We're more creative, more innovative in getting to solutions out there. And so the mission and we're much more effective in getting there, no matter what your industry is. Everybody measures that a little bit differently. Certainly you have a very unique way to measure it in your industry. And coming out of my own profession around the military originally, we had a very unique way to measure it. But obviously a lot of businesses today, they measure that in profit and loss. But that being one of the important ones out there, though, is how can we make our organizations more effective? And for our employees, how do we create an environment, a workplace where we can all feel valued, where we can all feel like we come to work as our authentic selves, our whole selves, and can develop and grow just like everybody else in there. And that takes a level playing field to be able to do that, and reducing some of the gender equities. So I'll stop there because I know Tarath has his own ideas on this too.
Tarath, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi.
Hi. So I guess the best way to answer this question is to recognize that half of our patients are women. And I think that's really important, at least as I realized coming out of the medical profession, that's why women should be in leadership roles in medicine and in radiology particularly. And it's important that we, as a specialty and as a profession, resemble the patients that we see. And so having women in higher levels in our own profession is really important to, to provide better patient care. And the other thing kind of going along with that is that women do bring a lot of different viewpoints and diversity of opinions that you may not necessarily get with men. I think that's why having women in leadership roles is really important.
You know, one of the other ones that we didn't write specifically about in Athena Rising, but we did spend quite a bit of time in our new book coming out next year on male allies, is also the issue around in the workplace that, and I think this is really important for the medical community broadly, as you think about healthcare, and again, how do we address specific things that are gendered, and that goes everything from the research side to the care side to the recognition and everything else. And I'm not going to lecture to a bunch of medical doctors here about this, but about the importance. But I think it's critical, right? That we recognize that, hey, we need to have a gender equal profession and workplace out there. So, and that means representation and parity has to be part of it.
Thank you so much. That's very true. And also, I just posted a series of like a little tutorial, I guess, on Twitter, because it's a tutorial, about just various studies that have been done where they show that having women and a more diverse workforce improves that certain industries' output or creativity, or however they decided to measure it in that particular study. So there's a lot of information out there demonstrating that women and having, minorities in your workforce, especially in leadership, improves how your company will do.
I think those are all great. I'm just looking, I don't see if that anyone's asked a question or used the chat option. Agnes, do you see if anyone's raised their hand? Is there anyone in our participants who maybe have a thought about or would like
Not
to
yet,
do questions?
but I like those friends of mine in there. Welcome.
Yeah, good to see everyone. Thank you all for joining.
I just want to say one more thing before we move from here, and I don't know the exact citation of this study, but it was looking at female who present to the emergency room with myocardial infarction or heart attack symptoms, and female physicians were more likely to recognize those symptoms than male physicians. And I think the authors kind of found better outcomes in those patients when they were treated with female physicians as opposed to male physicians. So
that's very true, Tarath. And I think there's a similar study about minority physicians and minority patients. So representation really does matter, and it will also help to improve patient outcomes.
Absolutely. Well,
Does anybody else have any comments from the audience? We'll wait for another 30 seconds, and if not, we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, it might be a good idea to move on to the next question, because I think this is a topic that will kind of come up for why more women should be on the table, because I think a lot of the questions now start to address that. So again, I'll start with our guest moderator, our author here. Why did you wrote in your book that women can't really mentor other women? And I don't think you meant that they cannot. I think you meant more like maybe they can as well. So wanted you to expound upon that, and what is that relationship like, if it exists, and what you meant by that. And then if that's a little bit challenging to answer, maybe perhaps what are the differences between female mentees having a male versus a female mentor?
Yeah, great question. And so the point of that is not that women can't mentor other women, because certainly they do, and they can, and they should. And the challenge, and in particular around the topic that we're writing about in trying to get men engaged in the professional development of people who don't look like them broadly, including women, it tends to be a pure numbers game. And again, especially it's highlighted in a lot of the traditionally male professions out there. I can tell you that there's a lot of resources today and a lot of great recruiting going on across companies and professions out there, and we are doing a great job, I think, generally, or at least much better job over the last 10 years or so in recruiting a much more diverse workforce coming in the front door. The challenge, though, is that if we're bringing in a lot of women in the front door, the challenge is then they need the mentoring, they need the sponsoring, they need the advocacy as they are continuing to grow and develop in their profession and through their careers. But as you go up through the ranks, as you look through the hierarchy of across an organization, we tend to find is that the numbers dwindle pretty quickly, especially after the first couple levels of leadership. The numbers dwindle pretty quickly for traditionally underrepresented minorities, including women. And so if there's a small percentage of women in the more senior leadership roles who tend to be more of the mentors, they can't possibly mentor the vast numbers that are coming through the front door, right? So it turns into very much a numbers game. And and even if they could, they have day jobs. They have a lot of responsibility, and that they need to be things that they need to be doing in addition to the mentoring. And it's not fair to kind of say, oh, only women can mentor other women, right? No, the men need to be engaged in that as well. So certainly there are, and there are a lot of women who are out there mentoring junior women, and that will continue. I hope. I don't see why it won't. But the other aspect, I think, from a cross-gender perspective, is that there's a lot of great benefits. If you think about mentoring in the sense that we're talking about it, and this is from a holistic perspective, that it's much more of a mutual reciprocal relationship, and not so much the old traditional kind of a guru model, where you have the one mentor, and that mentor is going to give you all this great sage advice and show you the golden path of your career and give you all the right answers, and off you go, and life will be wonderful. And the reality is that that's not the case, and most people along the way figure that out, that, hey, one, my mentor doesn't have all the magic answers out there, and two, having one mentor is probably not going to be sufficient for me, because they can't possibly mentor me across a lot of the domains from a holistic perspective. The nice part about a cross-gender, and this goes across any diverse aspects out there broadly, is that if you think about mentoring as more of a network, so you have a group of, if you're a mentor, you're also a mentee, right? Because you have your own mentors out there, and then you have your own mentees. If you think about that as your broader mentoring network, that we should look at that in the same way we look at our other professional networks. Of those should be diverse, and in the sense that that's going to aid us in a variety of different ways. And what the research shows, and we also found when we did the the cross-gender research for the book is that for the men, the male mentors, in this case with the female mentees, there were a lot of benefits for them, in particular by mentoring people who didn't look like them, because they had increased access to information they wouldn't have otherwise had. We find that they have more diverse and broader, extensive networks than people who don't mentor diverse folks. Those networks are sometimes internal and sometimes they extend to external, outside your profession or outside, maybe in your case, maybe outside your hospital or your network itself. The other one that we think is really compelling, and I think is my favorite, is the fact that we found that men who were mentoring women also had enhanced interpersonal skills, so increased higher empathy, more EQ, and certainly who doesn't want that, right, in a leader and a mentor. And the wonderful thing about that also is that that doesn't only exist in the workplace, right? You get to take that home with you. And so we find that, again, in the same way, when you go home, they're better partners, better spouses, better parents when they go home as well. So the cross-gender, I would say, actually, we should think about our mentoring networks or constellation out there, and think about if you just real quick did an audit of the people that you mentor and the people you are mentored by. What is that? Who do they look like? Are they all just like you? And for white men in particular, that tends to be the case, that they're only white men in their mentoring network. But those who do have a more diverse network of mentees and mentors, right, are seeing a lot of those access to those benefits. And those specific benefits are also what drives a lot of those outcomes we find in the organization that we're looking for, right? So if we think about the better decision making, better creativity, better solutions, better accomplishment of the mission, the job that you're trying to do, a lot of that is coming through that, again, having relationships with people who don't necessarily look like you, because they're getting to see and understand a different perspective. They haven't walked a mile in somebody else's shoes, and they're able to better coordinate and help their employees, as well as maybe their clients and customers, in your case, your patients out there. So I'll stop there, because I know a lot of people have some other thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of follow up on what Dr. Smith said and kind of bring it into what I've seen and what I've read here about medicine, and particularly radiology. There's the so-called leaky pipeline, and I think radiology, it's pretty acute. You look at the current batch of medical students, 50% of them are women, 25% of radiology residents are women. And then you go up to the ranks, up through the ranks in academic radiology departments, and you see that number dwindle. Now, I think that's, on one hand, it's due to the leaky pipeline, but it's also because historically radiology has been a male-dominant specialty, and it still is. And so it's hard for the women who are coming into radiology to find other women mentors, because there just aren't that many of them. And as Dr. Smith said, those women who are at the top don't have infinite time to mentor all these women. And the other thing is that, kind of to go along with that, I think there was a study that was just recently published showing that something like 1/3 of all women who enter practice after finishing residency, they're either part-time or completely out of medicine after 6 years. And so that's a reflection of, I think, outside responsibilities, which culturally and societally women do. But it also extends into the workplace, because it takes time to move up through the ranks. So I think it's kind of a confounding issue.
I agree, Tarath. I just want to make 2 comments on some of the things that you said. And the first being that, this is Agnes, by the way. Hi, everybody. The first being that about the leaky pipeline. So the problem is that, like you said, is that radiology is still a boys' club. And it's not just that it's hard to break in, we're actively discouraged from doing certain things. We're still being asked about having children and do we have a family and are we married during interviews. This has still happened this year. Residents are still being harassed by attendings. This has happened this year, of course, not reported. It's just so sad that in 2019, these things are still happening, but programs are small and nobody wants to say anything because they don't want to lose their spot. It's competitive. Diagnostic radiology, interventional radiology is a very competitive residency. These are very competitive residencies, and nobody wants to be the one making allegations, losing a year while in a legal battle or whatever. And I've talked to some of these women, and truly, not much can be done short of, change has to come from the top, I think, in this. So to follow up, my second point is that, women make great mentors and sponsors for women, but like you guys said, there are not a lot of them. I think as far as mentorship, it doesn't really matter, but I think it's very important for women to also seek out male sponsors. In other words, men who are higher up in the organizations who can really help them and root for them and recommend them, because there's a difference between mentoring and sponsoring. And sponsorship is very important. Networking is very important. And I think, like it was noted in the book and 20 other books I read on the topic, men go out and play golf, and I don't like golf. My sister likes golf. Maybe she should have done radiology, but I don't like it. So I would never go and play golf with the guys. I hang out with the guys other places, but I just don't like golf. So again, it's much more challenging. They're all talking about their wives and how cute their nanny is, whatever. And I just can't get into that conversation, right? So it's very challenging.
So this is actually a good segue into one of our registrants had a question, which is, how do we, as women, how do we break through? The men who we'd love to this message from are not the ones who have picked up this book. So how do we introduce them to this subject of mentoring women? Should we give it as a clever white elephant Secret Santa gift? Or what do you suggest? And this is a question, I guess, better for our author. Teamwork when you notice that men are not branching out and being more diverse with their mentorship pool.
Yes, and that's a great question. So thanks to the participants who brought that out. So it's interesting, right? So yeah, you could do the white elephant, and you could say, oh well, we could give the book to somebody, but there needs to be a more systemic solution to this. And so I guess the short answer is that, and this is where I think Agnes hit it right on the money, is this is a leadership issue, right? It has to come from the top. And so from an organizational perspective, this mentoring and sponsoring both need to be a part of who we are and what we do in our organization. So put it in terms of a kind of either org behavior or culture perspective, that it's a part of who we are. And so you can also tie that back into, we've seen organizations do this, that they recognize that, if you're going to retain people, so in other words, and I think, Tarath, you were talking about the leaky pipeline, and often that gets blamed for a lot of the retention issues in particular. But really, from a leadership perspective, the organizational leaders have got to recognize that, hey, if you value diverse talent, you have to find ways to retain people and understand what the issues are in particular. And so if mentoring and sponsoring, and we know these are valuable to every organization out there, then you've got to find ways to reward it, to incentivize it, right? Incentivizing structures within the organization. How do I hold senior people within the organization responsible for doing the mentoring and doing the sponsoring? And there are companies out there today that are doing this. They're putting it on evaluations, they're tying it to pay, they're there's a whole host of ways, right, where you make it part of the manager or the leader's responsibility to be doing that and to demonstrate it. That's one way to think about it. Another way, we like to think about creating a mentoring culture, mentoring and sponsoring culture within an organization. I think there's some that are out there that are doing a great job. In particular, on the medical side, the one I do know, and this is not an endorsement for them, but at Weill School of Medicine with Cornell in New York, they're working really hard at doing this, and they actually have she's I think I'm trying to think of her title, assistant dean for mentoring. And so that's how much emphasis and resources they're putting into the programs to try to create a mentoring culture in the organization and finding ways to incentivize the mentoring and sponsoring. And that's everything from education to finding ways to incentivize, to hold people accountable for. And they're starting with they started with the top. They're starting with the leadership of the deans in particular, and then working their way on down through to the academic organizations. So really, really important that that we find ways to, you can think about it as a compliance piece as part of evaluations or how I'm evaluated as a leader, but you can also think about ways to incentivize it in the organization. And leaders can do this in a variety of different ways. They can find ways to talk about mentoring in a host of different spaces where they're working. I know a particular academic dean who used to walk around, I'm assuming he probably still does this, but he would walk around with Starbucks gift cards. They were like $5 or $10 Starbucks gift cards. He always had a few of them in his pocket, and when he would come across faculty, he would ask him, he's like, so, you know, are you mentoring anyone? And if they said, hopefully they said yes, that he would ask them about how that was going and what they were getting out of it and what was working well for them, and they would have a conversation about it. And at the end, he would hand them one of these Starbucks cards and say, hey, next time you get together your mentees, have coffee on me. And it's, again, we don't always have a lot of money and resources to work with. And so finding, again, a way to talk about it and incentivize it in small little ways is another way to think about how to do that. But that is a great question. I think it needs to be a leadership issue. I have ideas about if your leadership is not engaged in this, I have other ideas about how to do this from more of a grassroots level, if you would like to talk more about that part.
Well, I think that was great, and it actually kind of leads into question 3, which is pretty much what this participant asked, which is, what can we say to men who haven't read this book to feel comfortable mentoring women? And I mean, my kind of response to this is, it's tough, but it takes a little bit of courage on our part to speak up. And I have found that what can work is kind of chipping away at it rather than being super forceful. So for example, in my practice, we are having elections for the board, the president-elect, CMO, et cetera, of the private practice. And, you know, one thing I noticed right away was everybody running is a man. And we actually have a fair number of women, a nice percentage of women in our practice. It's not 50-50, it's 25%, which is kind of the norm for radiology. So I felt a little disappointed, but I'm brand new with this practice. But as people were sending out their mass emails of why they should be elected, I would reply individually to the candidates who specifically mentioned women or mentioned identity, and I would thank them and just kind of say, you know, for example, one of my coworkers was the first one to do it. I replied to his email and just said, you know what, great candidate speech. And I also would like to thank you for being one of the first people to point out that women are just as important as men in our practice, and for calling that out, but also making it clear that we're equal. And he replied, and he was just like, oh, wow, I didn't really realize that I had done that, but thank you for pointing it out. I appreciate the compliment. So how do we break through? What can we say? You know, we kind of, it's tough, but I think we need to put ourselves out there, chip away at it. Well,
this is Agnes. I just have a quick comment about that. I think that one, the organization can reward men for mentoring women and minorities, period. There has to be some sort of a reward. I find that in organizations, we end up doing a lot of this work on our free time for free, and it's extremely challenging. You're already on so many committees and you're in charge of this, and now you have to meet somebody, and it's just an extra thing to do. So if there's some kind of a reward, it encourages people to do that. I mean, I'm not saying that we should do it just for the reward, but certainly it just makes it less arduous, right? The task. And the other thing I wanted to say is, you know, some men will say that they're afraid of mentoring women because they don't want to be either, or they don't want to be labeled as helping women because that's uncool, or they're even being attacked for helping women and mentoring women. And you know, I've had more than one guy tell me that they've received messages from people for making pro-women posts, et cetera, and I mean, this kind of behavior is high school. This is not okay. I mean, this is just silly. I mean, I don't even understand the point. And then my last point is that most of my mentors, when I was in the military, have been men, because, well, in the same as radiology, there just aren't a lot of women to go around, especially leadership positions. And they have been just phenomenal. You know, as far as, you know, the 2 or 3 mentors male mentors that I had in the military. So it is possible to have a fabulous mentoring type of relationship. I mean, I learned so much. I also learned that I shouldn't be in the military, but after 14 years, it's time to go. But they've been just phenomenal. And then, okay, now for real, it's the last point. You know, for the men that fear attack, or feel like they're going to be falsely accused of harassment, et cetera, you won't be. Just don't harass women. Don't rape women. Don't harass women, and assume we don't want to date you. That is all you have to remember, and everything's going to be fabulous. We're going to have a perfectly fabulous platonic mentoring relationship. It's my only advice.
And Agnes, that's actually a good segue into our next question, because in question 4, and also, you know, in Dr. Smith's book, you talked about some kind of mentoring traps that women can fall into, or men can fall into, as these role play type mentorship relationships. And you almost kind of hit it on the head, but you know, so I guess I wanted to ask people, maybe, and hopefully some of our participants can chime in, but have any of us women fallen into these traps? And for the men who are participating, have you experienced any of these roles, or have you witnessed these roles, and what steps could either the mentor or mentee take if one of these roles is happening? So I think the book really focused on what men can do, which is recognize that a woman is a human being, just like another man, with the same goals and ambition, etc. But maybe what can we mentees do if we recognize we're falling into, you know, a father figure type relationship, or a chivalrous knight, or, you know, the more dangerous Me Too type flirtatious one?
David, do you want to hit on this a little bit? What other people are thinking?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So let me try to see if I can wrap up a bunch of these in one real quick long comment, maybe. So these particular relationships, these traps you have listed here, you know, we call these guys man scripts, right? So these are the social scripts that men have learned, they've been socialized into as being appropriate from a cross-gender perspective. And often, not that all men follow these, or any one or of these in particular, but they will often, men who are uncomfortable or maybe a little anxious about a cross-gender relationship at work, may fall back on one of these particular scripts that they were socialized in, because in many cases what men will tell you is that you know, they weren't necessarily socialized at home growing up And this, of course, I think this changes generationally a little bit as well, but certainly as you think about Gen Xers and some of the baby boomers that are left out there still in the workplace, that they were socialized into some of these, and they weren't socialized into, hey, what's a professional, intimate, non-sexual relationship look like with a woman at work? And most of the men would tell us, like, I don't know what that is. I don't know. And so they would just avoid it, period, because they're like, hey, if you tell me, you ask me about a relationship with my mother, with my sister, with my daughter, with my wife, yeah, I understand, and I know what those relationships are all about, and I'm very comfortable with those. But then come back to these other relationships at work, and they suddenly are like, I wasn't really socialized. I wasn't given a script, so to speak, to follow and what those look like out there. And so they get very uncomfortable. They get anxious. And of course, when we think about anxiety, of course, what do? We run away from things that don't make us comfortable or make us anxious. We don't go towards them. And so this is one of the challenges in particular with engaging some men and why they avoid mentoring people who don't look like them, especially women. The WIMP penalty that I think Agnes brought up as well is there's great research out there on this in social science, and that men associated with gender initiatives or with women or advocating on behalf of women essentially lower their status by being associated with women, and so therefore are looked on by other men, and they receive this WIMP penalty. But there's some other conflicting research that also shows that men, when it comes to diversity and inclusion initiatives in particular, that men who advocate on behalf of these initiatives and do the work, they often get a bump up in their evaluations as opposed to women who get a bump down in their evaluations, because men who do this kind of work in particular situations are seen as gender champions, right? Champions of the diversity inclusion initiatives, whereas women are showing favoritism or cronyism in some way, right? Because it's self-interest, and that's a double penalty for women because they're not allowed to be self-interested, of course, by stereotype. So it's really kind of interesting. The other aspect around the fear piece that men have, especially and this existed before Me Too, but it just got exacerbated by when Me Too became so widespread, was this fear of suddenly they were going to be falsely accused of sexual harassment in the workplace. And Brad and I always like to, when we're talking to male audiences in particular, like to remind the guys in the audience, like, hey, let's just do a quick reset here and remember what Me Too is all about. As Agnes very clearly stated, Me Too is about women expecting to be able to come to work and not be harassed and not be assaulted. I mean, it's a really low bar. We could do a heck of a lot better than that, right? It's like just saying don't harass and don't assault that's nice, but I think we should be way beyond all of that, right? And we can do a lot better. And for men in particular, in the discourse around Me Too about this false sexual harassment, guys have got to push back. They got to wave the bullshit flag on this one right here, right up front, and say no. As it turns out, there is no empirical evidence that shows that women do any sort of false harassment claims in any sort of significant numbers that are measurable in any way. There's anecdotal evidence of it, yes, but there's no evidence otherwise out there. So we need to push back on that and remember what Me Too was all about out there.
It's not in the woman's best interest to make such a claim, period. I mean, even women who have been harassed, who have been raped, don't want to come forward because of the stigma associated with it. No one in their right mind would make something up. And granted, there is a handful of people who are not in their right mind.
Sure. But
those are probably not the people that you'll encounter at work most of the time. I mean, it's literally a tiny percentage, right?
Right. And I always, unfortunately, we don't have the research to go with this for sexual harassment because this is really challenging research to do in social science. But certainly around sexual assault, we know that it's the most underreported crime, right, in the workplace and outside the workplace as well. And we expect that sexual harassment largely follows suit with that too, for the same exact reasons that you just stated, right?
And your comment that it's a low bar, It is a low bar, but if we could just reach that low bar, life would be so much better, but sadly we're not there yet.
Absolutely. And this is where this gets beyond the, really kind of beyond the mentor and sponsor part of this, and really gets into the work that Brad and I have been doing the last couple of years now and writing our new book, which, oh, by the way, comes out next year. And the title was just decided by the editorial board at Harvard Business. So the title is going to be Good Guys, How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. And this is one of the things that we talk about extensively in there, is that, you know, again, how we show up at work matters, right? And showing up at work as allies is the way that we're working on that. And that means that there's two parts to that. There's one, you got to take individual accountability for yourself and showing, again, promoting gender fairness and equity through your own supportive and collaborative relationships with women. At the same time, you got to do the public piece, right? And so when you got to be advocating for the systemic changes that are going to change the workplace and really eliminate and level the playing field completely out there. And you can't do it just when you're in a mixed gender audience or a mixed gender, situation. A lot of times guys are going to be the only ones in the room. It's just going to be a room full of guys, and these sexist comments or behaviors and things will happen. And it's really interesting. Guys will, even though a lot of men in that room will be offended by what was said or done, nobody will say anything. And it gets back to kind of the bystander effect is part of it. But the other part of it is that there's an assumption that guys make about other men in the room, that they have a higher level of acceptance of sexist behavior and language than they do. And so therefore they're not going to say anything. And the reality is that once they recognize that most men don't, that they're willing to say, hey, no, actually, I don't agree with that, and I'm offended by it, and don't do that again, or don't say that again. That's not appropriate. And then sometimes guys will also, when there is a woman in the room, sometimes it might be the only woman in the room, as many of you probably have experienced, an ally, a male ally, cannot say, hey, John, that's not cool, don't say that, because Mary's right here in the room with us, and so that's not cool. No, that doesn't cut it. You have to own it. It has to be because it's not right and because it offends you, and you have to own it, and it's not because there just happens to be a woman in the room at the same time. So yes, a lot that goes into that, and that we have to change things in the behaviors and language and in the workplace. We've got to start stepping up our game and recognizing the damage that it's doing to ourselves, to our peers, our fellow employees, and our patients and customers out there, right?
Mm-hmm. If we move to question 5, we can probably address this a little bit more, but maybe from a little bit of a different angle. So what advice do we give to women who have been in not unhealthful and maybe not the best cross-gender mentorship relationships? And so kind of angling away from the Me Too something and focusing something that's a little bit more relevant to men. For example, especially in academic medicine and radiology, a lot of people work together to get published. And many of us, regardless of gender, have experienced our senior mentors either stealing or taking credit for our work. And sometimes I do kind of fall prey to this more often because it's easy for men to take advantage since she's not likely to say anything. So what advice and what can we women do if we've experienced something negative like this and we may not feel comfortable seeking another male mentor?
So a couple things. One, on the mentoring side of this in particular, is recognizing one that not everybody is cut out to be a mentor. I think we're not going to hurt too many people's feelings by saying that some people just don't have the skill sets to do this. Can you develop them? Yes. Can you become better at it? Yes. but it takes a certain amount of empathy and EQ and relationship skills and interpersonal skills to be a good mentor. And not everybody has that. Not everybody's cut out for it either. So one, I think it's if you're not getting out of the relationship what you're looking for, and you've talked about that with your mentor, then I think Brad and I advocate for having kind of a no-fault divorce in all mentoring relationships, that if it's not working out for one or the other, there needs to be a no-fault, that either party can end the relationship at whatever point they need to, no harm, no foul, and walk away from it. The other thing is, in finding and seeking out another male mentor, we often, when we talk to women about this, is the men typically in your organization who get it, right? Who probably have some of the higher EQ, empathy. They understand the dignity and respect issues around people have different experiences, and they're people who have a certain amount of curiosity about maybe your experiences, and they're helpful, right, in a lot of different ways. And so start by seeking out start with those people, the people that you hopefully you can find a connection with in a variety of different ways, and start with them. This is why, again, mentoring is a two-way street. And so for mentees, I think it's important that if they're looking for some mentoring, a mentorship, or to diversify their mentoring network, that when they see somebody that, like, wow, I think I could really learn something from him, or he could really help me with something in particular, or I'd like to learn more about something, is reach out and do that. At the same time, we would like senior men, and this goes for women as well, for senior leaders out there, when they recognize talent in the organization, one, just call it out. And when you get a chance to talk to that person, go, hey, I know you've only been here for a few years, but I saw you present the other day, or I saw you do this the other day, and wow, I see great opportunity for you in your career and what you're doing here, and I, if there's anything I can do to really help further that, let me know, because I'm really interested, and I think we need to do whatever we can to keep you here, kind of a thing, right? And so acknowledging that's from the senior to the more junior person in that relationship. But it has to work both directions. I think it's not always the mentors seeking out the talented mentees, and it's not always the mentees seeking out the mentors. It's going to have to be a little bit of both. To address the specific issue here about the stealing and taking credit, unfortunately, in both Athena Rising as well as in our new book, For Good Guys, I think every woman, and we interviewed hundreds of women between the two books, had at least one, if not multiple, stories about their ideas and their contributions being stolen by men, right, or taking credit for their ideas out there. And of course, the title, the term for this is bropropriation. So they talked about how they were bropropriated, and sometimes they also called it heap-eating. They were heap-eated in some way. But this, again, it shouldn't always fall back. Yes, it is a woman's problem because it's been done to her. But this is where, again, as mentors and as allies out there, if we are aware that these kinds of things happen, we can be watching for them. We can be aware that they might be happening in the situations where they could be happening. And when we see them, we figure out how we're going to take action depending on what it is. And so meetings, right? Meetings, this happens all the time. And I can tell you, yeah, as a guy, this rarely happens unless the few times I've ever seen it happen for a guy is if he might be really junior in the group, and he may not get the same kind of respect or attention to what he has to say as other men in the group. But for women, and in particular women of color, this happens all the time out there. And as men, if we see this happening, if we're aware that it's happening, we can stop it and we can say something. And wait, hey, hold on a second, John. I want to hear let Mary finish what she had to say, if she was interrupted, or hey, John, how is that what you just said there any different than what Mary just said a few minutes ago? Sounds like the same exact thing here. So maybe Mary could expound a little bit more on that, right? And the other one is as kind of as allies and as mentors, again, we can kind of amplify each other. So when there's a really good idea, and if you're a guy in a meeting like that and you see a woman make a great contribution and it doesn't get the credit that it probably deserves, is that you can, when you get a chance to step up and say something, you can start by talking about that idea, one, connect it back to her and to the potential and what it means maybe to the larger group or the larger meeting. You can even tie an action item to it, right? Of hey, we need to talk about this more, and maybe we can do this next about Mary's idea. So there's a variety of different ways to do that. The one in particular you talk about here with publications is really problematic, and you know, I would hope that, and I've seen a few minor instances of this in academia from the sociology side, and then I've seen one incredibly egregious case of it. That person is now a pariah in our community, and you can no longer say his name anymore because he got called out, and he got taken to court basically on it. So that was awesome that it got handled that way. But it's a lot of times these tend to be more minor, and it's harder to really nail somebody down. But this is where I think just you know, obviously trying to confront somebody specifically about it's challenging in a lot of different ways, but talking to other people, in particular other men that you trust, and this is why it's important that as men and women we have peer relationships, friendships in the workplace, that we can go to that honest broker and say, hey, you know, tell me, am I off base here? This is what happened. What do you think? And kind of get it validated, right, in a lot of different ways, or bounce it off somebody. And the same thing for guys, you know, if they're trying to do something, they can bounce ideas off of women as well the same way. So really important, I think, to have those peer relationships and friendships out there. And I'll be quiet now.
Well, David, I mean, you touched on a lot of things, and you know, I know this question kind of started out a little bit negatively, and you brought it to a positive light with all those examples that you gave. And so now I'm hoping we can, we only have like about 8 minutes left, so skip to our very last question and keep it on that positive note, because I think question number 8 really will kind of maybe hopefully drive some of the points you made home. And so, Catherine, if you don't mind skipping all the way to the last question, I can read it while you're doing that. So in the book, a lot of the women you interview describe positive male mentor relationships. And I'm hopeful either our panelists or maybe some of our attendees have examples of positive relationships that we've had cross-gender, and either we've had it personally or maybe something that we've witnessed in others. But I think if we hear more and more examples, maybe we can hear ideas on how to move forward. So Agnes, you mentioned in the military you had some good ones. If you want to maybe give a quick story on one.
Yeah, I've had several really good mentors, and one of them was a neurologist. I actually used to be an internist. I was an internal medicine resident at Madigan Army Medical Center, and I was rotating on neurology. And I used to get really bad migraines, but I didn't really tell anyone. I was having a really bad migraine, and so I think I wasn't necessarily pulling my weight on rounds that day. And you know, the resident in the team was kind of on my butt and trying to tell me to type faster the notes, and why didn't I catch this on the exam? And you know, it's neurology exam. I was like, I don't know what does this fork do? And he pulled me aside. It was Colonel Flynn, Dr. Flynn, and he said, "There's something wrong. This isn't you." And I mean, it's noting these little things in people and not immediately assuming that you're a slacker, et cetera, et cetera. And since then, we've, you know, until he died, you know, we've been really good friends for years since that time. And he's helped me with multiple things kind of throughout. And he was never my direct supervisor except on that one block in intern year. But whenever something was wrong, he would be the one I would call, because I knew that I would get a unbiased, well, maybe it was a little biased, but relatively unbiased opinion about the issue at hand. I think that actually the advice that he gave me was unbiased. It was, as far as what I should do, et cetera, as far as making decisions with my career in the military.
Yeah, and I think, and it's something you mentioned in your book, and I think I've already said it once, but it's important to reiterate. It's when men don't look at us as women, they look at us as, coworkers, colleagues, as people with the same goals and ambitions. And that's my positive relationships, and even ones that I've witnessed have been like. So for me personally, my practice has a kind of mentorship program. It's nothing super formal, but a new employee is assigned a mentor, and that person really is supposed to help you, get used to practice on the little idiosyncrasies. But my mentor is also one of my really good friends from residency, and he looks at me as his coworker in radiology. And he said something really great to me the other day, which was, my goal is to help you and almost kind of be like your lawyer. People have questions about you, because I am defending you on your way to becoming a partner, and I'm going to make sure that you get partnership. And that really felt good, because that was a really good friend who knows my work ethic, et cetera, and who's also looking out for me. And then another example, I always think of the examples that my mother gives me. She just retired after almost 40 years as an attending radiologist. And in her division of musculoskeletal, she has often been the only woman multiple times. And she gave me so many examples of being excluded, not necessarily intentionally, but kind of the whole boys club thing. And, examples of when one of her section chiefs was at this conference, and she said, no, you have to be sponsored. And he's like, no one sponsored you yet? Well, then I'll sponsor you. And it was just a no-brainer. And the same when a new section, the chairman started in the 80s, and he was looking at everybody's salaries, and it bothered him that my mother was paid less and she's doing just as much work as the men. And so he equalized her salary because it didn't make sense to him. So it's just examples of people who look at women as another human being and not as someone inferior or less than. So those are my examples for this question.
Still about 2 minutes. Do any of the people who have called in, any of our attendees, want to raise their hand? And this is probably the first chat where nobody's said anything, but I know you guys are all intently listening.
If we have a few minutes, can I ask Dr. Smith a question? I think that's kind of related but unrelated. Yeah, so I want to ask you about, and I've been thinking this for a while, particularly as it relates to kind of societal pressures that are placed on women that aren't necessarily placed on men when it comes to moving through the hierarchy, and what role do these societal pressures, genderized norms, I guess is one way to think of it, impact women going through the hierarchy in the workplace, whether it's in medicine or any other workplace, and how that affects mentorship.
So are you talking about, again, kind of the gendered workplace norms?
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Well, and home pressures as well too, raising a family, yeah. and the secondary pressures like that as well.
Yeah, and so, and again, in our new book, one of the things is we were getting to how we can be better allies at work, and this, again, there's parts of this that gets into the mentoring too, because I think great male mentors will keep this in mind. But setting the example, I mean, if we're going to eliminate gender inequity in the workplace and get to gender parity, it's got to start at home. And so the first thing for guys is that you can't be an ally, a great gender ally at work, until you're first a gender ally at home. And so that means if you're married or if you're a parent or whatever, that, hey, you got to do the dishes. You got to do your 50%. You got to take the kids to the doctor. You got to take the kids to whatever. And if you think you're already at 50-50 at home, ask your spouse, ask your partner, how am I doing? Are we doing 50-50? Have a quick audit there. And when you're given honest, hopefully honest feedback, and maybe it isn't 50-50, that you actually do something with that and change the way you're doing things. Because until we begin to equalize things at home, we're never gonna make significant changes in the workplace. And so we've got to start with becoming better allies and becoming equal at home first. And but as far as I think changing things at work, I think again there's a lot of these gender norms that have been around for a long time, because in most cases the traditionally male professions, this is work that was created by men for men, to do this. And so we've got to really begin to start to change the workplace, the structural pieces of the workplace. And until men are doing their 50-50 at home, there's really not a lot of pressure. There's no social pressure. There's no social impetus to change things in the workplace as much. So getting to paid family leave, getting to work flexibility, to change the structure of how and when and where we do our jobs is not really going to make significant differences until again we can begin to see how there's a requirement to do that at home. And there is a requirement, right? Because we all, for the most part, certainly in America, most families today are dual career, dual earner families today. The days of the single breadwinner are long gone, assuming they ever really existed to begin with. So if we're all working out there, we've got to begin to equalize things and change the workplace so that we can all have a fair shake at it.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, everybody, all of our attendees, and David, Tarath, Taj, Catherine is on there somewhere as well. I think I really enjoyed the conversation today.
Yeah. I did too, and thank you, David, so much for being available and participating and really being a champion for women. This was a great book, and we look forward to reading your next one for sure.
Well, thank you, and for everyone out there, feel free to continue the conversation with yourselves and with me. If you want to connect with me on social media somewhere, I'm happy to continue the conversation.
We are already connected.
And thanks, Agnes, for reaching out.
Well, thank you, everyone. Stay tuned for our next book club, and we will be announcing more about it shortly. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Good night.
Good night.